Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Roman Research Trust Joan Pye lecture. My name is Neil Holbrook. I'm the chairman of the Roman Research Trust, and I'm also chief executive of Cotswold Archaeology. And I'm pleased that Cotswold Archaeology are hosting the lecture tonight on behalf of the Roman Research Trust. Before we kick off, just a few basic housekeeping matters. Attendees, please feel free to use the chat box to say hello and tell us where you're joining from. Last year, we had a lot of people joining from outside of the UK, from America, and that's excellent. It's always great to see where people are joining from and the spread of interest in Roman Britain. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the talks. If you'd like to propose a question, please do this via the Q&A box, and I'll select a few at the end to read out to Nick. If anyone experiences technical problems, please contact us again via the Q&A function, and we'll try and resolve this. We're recording this lecture tonight, and we will be posting this on Cotswold Archaeology's YouTube channel in the next week or so. Lastly, as you leave the webinar at the end of tonight's event, there'll be a short survey to help us gather your feedback. There are only 4 questions, and it only takes a couple of minutes at most to complete, so we would appreciate it if you were able to complete. Now, really, just to kind of come to the meat of tonight's event, the Roman Research Trust was established in 1990 as an educational charity that furthers understanding of Roman Britain. We do this via a range of grants which support excavation, research, and other educational activities. In many ways, the shop window, the Joan Pye lecture is our shop window. Joan was a former trustee of the Roman Research Trust, and upon retirement, she donated a sum of money to support a biennial lecture on any aspect of Roman Britain. The first Joan Pye lecture was delivered in 2002 by Barry Cunliffe. So today is the 20th anniversary of the Joan Pye lectures beginning. As a consequence of COVID, we moved the lectures online, and last year, Jane Webster from Newcastle University delivered a lecture on slavery in Roman Britain. And delighted to say that we had over 6,000 views of that lecture on the Cotswold Archaeology YouTube channel. So given the great statistics and the popularity, we decided to make this now an annual event hosted online. This year, 2020, is the 1900th anniversary of the traditional date of construction of Hadrians Wall in AD 120. And so we were keen to host an event to kind of celebrate that anniversary. And looking back, curiously, this is the first time that Hadrians Wall, or the north frontier of Roman Britain, has featured in the Joan Pye lecture. And so I'm delighted to introduce Nick Hodgson to speak to us this evening. Nick is one of my oldest friends, and so it's always curious to try and introduce someone we've known for many years, 40 years in our case. But Nick was born and bred on Tyneside. He read history at Oxford before going on to do postgraduate research on Roman frontiers at Newcastle University. After completing his thesis, he then did what many of us would love to do. He spent decades excavating on sites on Hadrian's Wall, in particular the Roman forts at South Shields and Wall's End. Nick's published very widely on many aspects of Roman Britain, Roman Scotland, and Hadrian's War in particular. And I would in particular draw you towards his 2017 book, Hadrians Wall, Archaeology and History at the Limits of Rome's Empire. A really excellent account of Hadrian's Wall and a fantastic way to get into that most complex topic. Nick has a paper in the forthcoming edition of the journal Britannica, which deals with the vexed question of the end of the 9th Legion. And that seemed like an excellent opportunity to invite Nick tonight to speak on that topic for the Joan Pye lecture. So I'd now like to pass over to Dr. Nick Hodgson to deliver the Joan Pye lecture. Nick.
Thank you, Neil, for that introduction. I'm sure that everybody listening tonight has heard of the famous 9th Legion, the Roman legion that disappears from history, lost in mysterious circumstances. The old story, the traditional story of the disappearance of the legion runs as follows. At the outset of Hadrian's reign, that's AD 117, there was a terrible war in Britain on the basis of an ancient literary statement that at Hadrian's accession, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. The 9th Legion marches north from its fortress in York into the mists of Scotland to meet with destruction, and is replaced 5 years later by the 6th Legion, Legio Six Victrix, known to be permanently based at York under Hadrian, who visits Britain and builds his famous wall in AD 122. So this is the version of the story that we get in Rosemary Sutcliffe's famous 1954 children's novel, The Eagle of the Ninth. You see the cover here, the original 1950s edition on the left, a later edition with 60s psychedelia on the right-hand side. And outside the academic world, this version of the story has lingered on, as in the recent film version of Sutcliffe's story, which was simply entitled The Eagle. But in the academic world, it's a different story. And it's generally firmly stated that the 9th Legion was transferred from Britain before its disappearance in unknown circumstances. And any person consulting scholarly general works on Roman Britain over the last couple of generations could easily get the impression that the issue is finally resolved, at least as far as Britain is concerned. The disappearance of the Legion doesn't involve Britain. Since the 1970s, the possibility that the 9th was in Britain when it ceased to exist has disappeared so thoroughly from the educated public consciousness that many believe its departure from the island to be a matter of fact. Tonight, I want to ask how this view came about and what are the actual facts. Well, there are two absolutely fixed points. The latest dated record of the Legion on an inscription or anything like that is in Britain at its fortress in York, where we have this magnificent inscription, or a fragment of a magnificent inscription, which was recovered from the southeast gate of the fortress in the 1850s. And you can see the name of the 9th Legion in the bottom line. Notice that the 9 is spelt out as V1111 and not 1X. We'll see this again later. The point about this inscription is it's closely dated by the titles of the Emperor Trajan to the year 108. And that's it. That's the last firmly dated inscription naming the legion. The second fact is that the legion had ceased to exist by around AD 165, because then a list of the legions was set up in Rome. We have the complete text of that, and the 9th Legion does not appear on that list. Now, in the 1920s, so a century ago, it was realized that the 9th Legion can't have ceased to exist quite so early as the traditional story has it in 117. The problem lay in the career inscriptions of 2 of its officers who were thought most unlikely to have served in the Legion that early. Now we'll come back to them and I'll explain why it was that they couldn't have served quite so early. Combined with this, I think it was the realization that the Legion must have existed in the early 120s, which is when Hadrian's Wall was begun. But from whose building records it is completely absent. There are no building inscriptions from Hadrian's Wall which mention the 9th Legion. And I think this really sowed the seeds of doubt about whether the Legion was still in Britain at that time. But the next major development was the publication in the 1960s of 2 tile stamps of the 9th Legion, illustrated here, found not in Britain, but at Nijmegen, a legionary fortress on the Rhine frontier of Lower Germany. And there are other traces of the 9th Legion in that area. Here we see a piece of horse harness, which is inscribed with the name of the Legion. This time the numeral is 1X rather than V1111. And this remarkable altar with a beautiful depiction of Apollo, which was dedicated by a praefectus castrorum, a camp prefect of the 9th Legion, at Aachen, a spa in northern Germany, but reasonably close to the Nijmegen base. So what did, sorry, I'll just go back to those tile stamps. What did Dutch archaeologists make of these at the time? Well, the argument was that that these were best placed after the movement of the 6th Legion to Britain. In other words, after the early 120s. In 1972 saw the publication of a document which seemed to show that a former officer, a military tribune of the 9th, named Numesius Union, was consul in the year 161. and could not, therefore, have served in the legion before about 135, 140 or so. Now, we'll come back to him and that issue. But all of this, the point is, in the 70s, this added weight to the view that the legion had left Britain, and also added weight to a suggestion by Eric Burley that the legion might have been moved eventually east to be destroyed by the Parthians at a place called Eligea in Armenia in 161, where the historian Cassius Dio, at least in the English translations, says that a legion was annihilated. However, there is in fact nothing about the 9th Legion tiles at Nijmegen, which you see here, or their context that dates them to the period after AD 120. And now a new generation of Dutch archaeologists prefer to see the legion's traces there as connected to something else that we see on stamped tiles from this fortress, a formation of troops called the Expeditio Britannica, a detachment or a set of detachments made up of troops from various units in Britain. And these seem to be best placed in the years between about 104 and 120. These British troops filling a gap caused by the transfer of the Nijmegen base's usual legion to fight in Trajan's Dacian War. Now, if this is right, the implication would be that there was only ever a detachment of the 9th present at Nijmegen, and that would make sense, as it seems to have been building in York in 108, as we've seen. Another detachment of the 9th in the same period was active near Carlisle, so on the northern frontier of Britain in this period. As we see from these tiles, this one labeled Carlisle, this one labeled Carlisle, and this is where they were made. A legionary tile at a place called Scalescuff, which is close to Carlisle. So the picture that has emerged in more recent years is really of a period between about 104 and 120, when part of the legion is on the continent, part on the northern frontier, and part at its base at York. And all of this evidence is quite consistent with the whole of the legion being back in Britain by the early AD 120s. So we've mentioned the careers of officers who served in the legion. What do these careers actually tell us? Well, this takes us into the field of what is known as prosopography. A very obscure word, but it simply means the academic study of ancient lives and careers based on documents. And most often in our case tonight, these documents are going to be stone inscriptions recording the careers of men who had risen to eminent heights. And in fact, it's evidence like this that really is the basic evidence for the story of the 9th Legion. You might imagine that archaeologists go digging for bits of inscription or evidence of the 9th Legion in the earth. But most of the important evidence for who served in the legion and when they served actually occurs outside Britain in inscriptions detailing the careers of Italian senators or provincial aristocrats who in their younger days, when they were in their teens, were officers in the 9th Legion. The inscription on the screen in front of you is a classic example. This one actually doesn't deal with the 9th Legion. It's the career inscription of a man called Pontius Laelianus, who, when this was erected in the Forum of Trajan in Rome, he'd reached the top of the tree. He was a friend and confidant of emperors, consul, highest office in the Roman state. And his whole career is laid out, but right down towards the bottom, you can see in this line here, the words trib, mill, leg, 6. And what he's saying here is that right at the beginning of his career, when he was only 18, 20 years old, something like that, he served as a military tribune in the 6th Legion. And we often know the date when men like these were consuls. And we know that if they served as a military tribune in the legion, that is likely to have been something like 20 years, often rather more, before the date they became consul. And we have the names of a handful of officers who served towards the end of the existence of the 9th Legion. This is a magnificent rock-cut tomb in Petra in Jordan, the rose-red city as old as time and all that. But this tomb is very special to us because high up above its elaborately carved doorway is an inscribed panel, now barely legible. But this tells us that it's the tomb of a man called Sextus Florentinus, and he was actually a commander of the 9th Legion. He was the legionary legate, the overall commander. At what date? Well, he was governor of Arabia in 126. That's why his tomb is in Arabia. We know that before that, he'd served a 2-year term in another office in the imperial service. So his command of the 9th Legion has to be before 124. And it might be quite a few years before 124. That's all we can say about him. And he is the last known commander of the Legion. A former tribune of the 9th Legion. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this transcribed inscription that's on the screen. I really just put it up there as a reminder that this is the kind of evidence that historians and archaeologists have to scrutinize. It's not excavation evidence that really provides the main evidence that we rely on. This man called Numesius Crispinus Saturninus was consul in 149 or 150. So he shouldn't have served as a tribune in the 9th any earlier than the early to mid 120s. Now, for some historians, this indicates that the 9th Legion was still in existence around about AD 130, because they subtract 20 years from his consulate in 149, 150 end up with 130. But it may well be, and there are many attested parallel cases, that Crispinus took longer than usual to reach the consulate. However, his career does show that the legion, or remnants of the legion, still existed in the 120s, so rather later than the traditional story had it. And then there is this apparent outlier that I mentioned earlier, a tribune of the 9th Legion named Numesius Union. And he's the real troublemaker in this historical issue, because he has been identified with a man of the same name who was consul in AD 161. So that would mean his service in the legion would have to be around about AD 140 or so. And this is why many claim that the 9th still existed or so around 140. However, it has been argued, not unconvincingly, I think, by Lawrence Keppy, who, he's no crank. He's a sober, meticulous scholar, student of Roman inscriptions. He has argued that Numesius Union, consul in 161, is not necessarily identical with, but might be the son or even the grandson of the Numesius Union who was tribune in the 9th Legion. And in fact, the inscription tells us that the Numesius Union who served in the 9th Legion, his son was also called Union. You can see this in the bottom line of the inscription, where restored, that would read Junior Patri, to his father. Union is dedicating this to his father, who is also called Numesius Union. So in fact, if Lawrence Keppy is right, it means that there's no compelling reason to see the legion as surviving up to around 140, and the tribune Numesius Union might have served before the 120s in pre-Hadrianic times. So if we set Numesius Union aside as an unproven case, and all the best authorities accept it's an unproven case, the remaining careers rule out the traditional loss of the legion at the outset of Hadrian's reign, around 117, but they are compatible with a loss or disbanding at some point in the 120s. Now, what of the supposed scenarios in which the legion is destroyed in the eastern part of the empire? Well, conceivably, the 9th could have found its way to Judea and have been destroyed in the second Jewish revolt of 132-5, as has been suggested. So that would be in this area here, modern Israel. But there is absolutely no evidence that it participated in that war, nor any trace of its presence there. The other idea is that the 9th was destroyed at Elager on the eastern frontier in 161. So in Armenia, just up here. The Greek word in the literary source translated as legion is stratopedon. Now, this is used in Cassius Dio's history in the technical sense of legion, but elsewhere in the same history, it's used in the sense of a military camp, an encamped force or garrison, or an army of occupation. And it's far from certain that the destruction of a specific legion at Eleger is meant. And most importantly, there is no archaeological trace whatsoever of the 9th Legion in the eastern part of the empire. On the other hand, a war or wars involving serious Roman losses undoubtedly occurred in Britain during Hadrian's reign. For the scale of the losses, we have the well-known testimony of Fronto, tutor of Marcus Aurelius, who reminded his pupil, and I quote, "When your grandfather Hadrian was emperor, how many soldiers were killed by the Jews? How many by the Britons?" An early 2nd century tombstone found at Vindolanda in the Hadrians Wall area as recently as 1997 commemorates an auxiliary centurion. You see the inscription here. And the key phrase here is in bello interfectus, killed in the war. It's difficult to date this war exactly, given that it's not actually mentioned in any ancient literary source. However, we hear from 2 inscriptions, and I'm going to put some rather forbidding looking transcriptions of them up on the screen, not expecting you to read them, but we hear from 2 inscriptions of an Expeditio Britannica, an expedition, a military expedition to Britain. And many would interpret that, the use of the word expeditio, as meaning that it was a military expedition where the emperor was present, which, if that was the case, would actually date this to AD 122. That is slightly controversial. However, the career of one of the participants, the one named in the upper inscription here, a man called Pontius Sabinus, shows that it must have occurred at least a few years later than the opening of Hadrian's reign in 117. And the second participant mentioned in the lower transcription here, Manius Agrippa, there's a lovely phrase here in the 3rd line down, electo a divo Hadriano et misso in expeditionem Britannicam. Personally chosen by the Emperor Hadrian and sent on the British expedition. Now, the Expeditio Britannica, which we hear about in these 2 inscriptions, was clearly not merely an exercise in strengthening the island garrison in order to build Hadrian's Wall. The term implies warfare, and Pontius Sabinus, in the uppermost inscription, we are told, and you can read it in this line here, brought legionary reinforcements numbering 3,000 across to Britain, detachments from continental legions. These troops were surely arriving at a moment of acute military crisis when severe losses had taken place. Now, in Hadrian's biography, in the ancient Historia Augusta, there's no mention of him conducting a war in Britain, but there is an intriguing phrase saying that he put many things right in the province. But the lack of mention of a major war means little in what is acknowledged by all to be a patchy and selective source. The careers of these 2 participants, incidentally, make a date any later than the mid-120s, rather improbable. Now, some associate this war with the presence of Hadrian in 122. Others have preferred to see the warfare as occurring slightly later than Hadrian's visit, perhaps around AD 124. But against that later date is the evidence of troop discharges from the British Army, which we know about from documents like this. These are diplomas, as they're known, and they are essentially discharge certificates given to auxiliary non-citizen troops on their discharge from the army to certify that they now have Roman citizenship. This, incidentally, isn't a Hadrianic one. It's a slightly earlier Trajanic example, which I've used simply because it's the only one I had a good image of. However, there was a great, one of these diplomas found on the continent many, many years ago, shows us that there was a great discharge of veterans from 50, as many as 50 auxiliary units in Britain in the presence of the emperor in AD 122, and further discharges in the following years. Arguably, this makes a major war between AD 122 and AD 127, the date of the latest of these diplomas, unlikely, on the basis that discharges would not occur during periods of heavy fighting. So, on balance, it may be seen as more probable that this major warfare was occurring in AD 122 or shortly before. This might also be the best explanation for the well-known dislocation and change of plan in the building of Hadrian's Wall. The building of the wall occurred in a series of stages. First of all, there was a plan for mile castles, turrets, and the so-called broad wall, a 10-foot wide stone wall, which was abandoned while incomplete. And you see that. What was actually built, you see the top of these four diagrams. Well, the first two of those, really. After the abandonment of this incomplete first phase, a second plan, completely different, was introduced, and this had a series of major garrison forts, you see in number 3 here, superimposed on the mural line. When, after a long interval, work resumed on the curtain wall itself, which had not got beyond foundation level in many places in the central sector of the wall, it was to a narrower gauge and a completely different specification. Now, to this day, you can see on the ground the abruptness with which the first plan for the wall was interrupted. In the 5 miles between the Portgate and North Tyne, so that's between 22 and 27 miles from the east end of the wall, broad foundation, that 10-foot broad foundation, has been laid throughout, and sections of broad wall had been raised, but these were interspersed with gaps, obviously intended building allotments, where nothing had been built above the broad foundation. And these gaps were later plugged at an unknown date by a very narrow curtain wall, only 6 feet wide. You see an example of this at a place called Plane Trees on Hadrian's Wall. There in the background is the 10-foot wide wall, which has been built up to full height. In the foreground of the slide, you can see broad foundation, nothing built above it, but the gap has been plugged with this much narrower wall. You're looking at the south face of the wall here. It's all flush on the north side. The broad wall building program had in fact been suddenly abandoned when incomplete. The builders called away for some urgent purpose, and usually this is usually supposed to be the call to build the forts of the second plan. But if a measured decision was made upon inspecting the work that forts were necessary, would an order really have suddenly gone out for everybody to stop work on everything at once? Surely the building program would have been adapted, not interrupted in a seemingly disorderly way. The structural evidence can be read to suggest that some serious emergency precipitated a sudden abandonment of work. Certain aspects of the second plan are explained if seen as a reaction to war and rebellion, especially the addition of forts for auxiliary units all along the line of a newly invented type, integrated with the wall curtain and designed for the rapid deployment of military force. So on this diagrammatic slide, you see the first plan for the wall shown in A above. Very little military force here, lots of openings, mile castles, turrets. And then the revised plan, where you have these projecting major garrison forts superimposed on the wall and actually entailing the demolition of lengths of wall that had already been built, showing a much more militarily effective kind of barrier, with the deployment of force very much in evidence. Now, here you see the two basic options, really. If we link this to a war in AD 122, here in the first column, it means that the building of Hadrian's Wall had begun before Hadrian's visit. Now, this is a long recognized possibility. It's repeatedly argued for every generation or so, but it's one that an increasing number of wall specialists are coming to think likely. The addition of the wall forts would then follow under the governor who arrived with Britain in AD 122, Platorius Nepos. This would be in the years 123, 124. Such a model gives a neat explanation for the wholesale transfer of the 6th Legion to Britain to replace the 9th, irreparably damaged or lost in the events leading up to an expeditio, a major war around about AD 122. If a pre-122 date for the beginning of the wall is entertained, the possibility must also be considered that if we're correct in, as many archaeologists do, in seeing the signatures of 3 legions in the first broad wall phase of Hadrian's Wall, then one of those must have been the 9th Legion. Now you may say, you said earlier there are no inscriptions of the 9th Legion from Hadrian's Wall. However, the first plan seems to have involved 3 legions, but only 2 are attested on inscriptions that can possibly be associated with the first plan. Those are the 2nd Legion Augusta and the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix. surely 9th Legion is unattested in the building of the first plan for Hadrian's Wall, but then so equally is the 6th Legion, of which no inscription can be attributed to the pre-fort decision phase of Hadrian's Wall building. The 6th, in fact, makes its first epigraphic appearance in the fort building period under Nepos, in an inscription such as this, inscription from above one of the gates, the fort of Holtenchesters on Hadrian's Wall, Hadrianic. It mentions the governor Praetorius Nepos, and there in the second line down you see we now have the 6th Legion building. So the idea that the 6th Legion arrived to replace the 9th in AD 122 and then proceeded to be one of the builders in the revised version of Hadrian's Wall with the forts added to it does make sense, and all of the archaeological and historical evidence is consistent with that. Just going back to the previous slide, it shows the other possible option, which has been argued for in recent times. That is that the wall is in fact begun at the time of Hadrian's visit in 122, and the interruption there might be somewhat later, around about AD 124, but it's equally possible. I mean, this is possible. I argued earlier, I indicated earlier that the discharge diplomas perhaps make this less likely, but there it is, it's a possibility. And if that's true, if that option is the correct one, it means that it's still consistent with a loss or destruction of the 9th Legion in Britain in the 120s. Incidentally, it's worth just noting that if we go for the option that I've favored, which has a war in 122 and the wall begun in AD 120, it does mean that we are 2 years late in celebrating the 1900th anniversary of the beginning of the building of Hadrian's Wall. We should have done it 2 years ago in 2020 during the midst of the pandemic. Well, I hope to have shown that the explanation for the disappearance of the 9th, just as probably, and one might say more probably, lies in unrecorded events in Britain. Though the events are unrecorded, they've left strong hints elsewhere, the mention of the Expeditio Britannica and this disorderly dislocation and interruption in the great project of building Hadrian's Wall. If correct, this has profound implications for the hostile climate in which Hadrian's Wall was built, and therefore the purpose that it was intended to serve. If we ask, when did the 9th Legion disappear? Where did it disappear and how? I hope I've shown that the when and the where is almost certainly Britain, and probably AD 122 or a few years later. On the how, well, perhaps to your disappointment, I've refrained from speculating on the exact circumstances of the Legion's defeat, destruction, or disgrace, whatever it was, whether it was north or south of Hadrian's Wall, whether brought about by external enemies or internal revolt or mutiny. These things may never be known, but they're bound to be the subject of much speculation in the years to come. So I'll leave it there, I think, with a couple of references at the end to where you might read more about this. Neil Holbrook kindly mentioned my book, Hadrians Wall, at the beginning, in his introduction. You can see the reference to it there. And the article on the end of the 9th Legion in Britannia, not forthcoming, as Neil said, but actually published a year ago. But anyone who wants to follow up the arguments that I've set out tonight in more detail, you'll find it set out in that article. So many thanks for listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that lecture. Fascinating and interesting in equal measure, and just goes to show the power of interest that still resides in Hadrian's Wall. I think that's shown as well. The fact we had over 300 people listening and viewing your lecture tonight, and also just from where they've come from. I had a quick look just before we started. We have people from Austria, Portugal, Canada, and New Zealand very early in the morning. So, you know, that shows that the power and interest in Hadrian's Wall spreads way beyond the bounds of just our country. As I said, this will be recorded, and we will be posting this lecture on our the Cotswold Archaeology YouTube channel probably within the next week. So keep an eye out for that. But really very fascinating, very clear, and so much interest in there. I have been keeping an eye on the questions that have come in, and if Nick, you're happy, I'll just ask you a couple of questions to start off.
I'll do my best.
Okay. Well, I thought the great question from Shona and Sunny is the evidence out there waiting to be found? Will we ever know the truth, or is this just destined to be a mystery of time?
Well, it is possible that further evidence will come to light. I would point, I'd remind Shona of the inscription that I showed that was discovered in Vindolanda, mentioning a centurion who'd been killed in the war, in bello interfectus, and that is almost certainly the war in Hadrian's reign that I've been talking about this evening. But that was found in 1997. So that itself shows that inscriptions do still come to light. And we all know this. Every year there is a crop of new inscriptions from Roman Britain, and there is a much wider harvest of new inscriptions from other provinces in the empire. So yeah, the potential is certainly out there for really decisive new discoveries. In terms of more traditional archaeological evidence, it's rather more difficult because, of course, a place like York, the base of the 9th Legion in the period that I've been discussing, archaeological intervention is very difficult. It's always going to be very limited because it's underneath a modern city. But all the same, especially in the world of developer-funded archaeology, the potential is there for new discoveries to come to light.
If I could just do a follow-up on that, Nick, I mean, do you think one day maybe a metal detectorist somewhere in North Northumberland or southern Scotland will reveal the telltale traces of a decisive battle where the legion may have been destroyed?
Well, that's certainly not impossible. And as some of the people attending tonight will know, one of the great and most famous legionary defeats in all Roman history, the destruction of the three legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions in Germany in the reign of Augustus, the actual site where that disaster occurred has almost certainly been discovered, thanks to the original discovery of the site, thanks to a British, not a German, a British metal detectorist working in the area near Osnabrück. And yeah, it's a battle site which has produced remarkable quantities of military equipment, coins, human and animal remains, a graphic testimony to disaster that occurred. And I think it is conceivable that you could find something similar in Britain. What I would say is that we don't have to necessarily assume that it was Scotland or the Hadrians Wall area where the 9th Legion came to grief, if it did come to grief in Britain at this time, as I've suggested. In his recent book on Roman London, Dominic Perring has associated the Hadrianic destruction deposit, fire deposit in that city with putative revolt in Britain during the reign of Hadrian. And it's entirely possible that if there was internal revolt in the island, that a military confrontation could have occurred further south than we would normally expect, and further south than Rosemary Sutcliffe would have expected.
Thank you. A couple of people, Tom and Karen, have just asked about the process of disbanding Roman legions and how common this was, and did legions have to be annihilated, or could they be disbanded or amalgamated with other units for other reasons? Is there much other evidence for legions just sort of disappearing from the scene?
Yes, there is evidence for other legions disappearing from the scene. It does happen. And the questioners are quite right in guessing or assuming or knowing that it's not always because of military defeat. There are examples of legions being disbanded because they've become mutinous or disloyal. And of course, that is a possibility with the 9th Legion. Although I do find it interesting that in later years, in the 140s, 50s, eminent men who had served in the Legion in their youthful days were in no way ashamed of putting the fact that they served in the 9th Legion in their career inscriptions. But yes, certainly legions are disbanded for other reasons, mainly to do with disloyalty or mutiny. But there are other clear examples of legions being either destroyed or disbanded. We never know exactly which it is, but certainly being defeated and ceasing to exist in warfare. In the 1st century AD, 2 legions disappear in quick succession on the Danube, one in the later 180s, one in the early 190s. So this does happen. And there are also just finally, there is another case of a legion, the second Deotariana, if I remember rightly, which disappears from history around about the same time as the 9th, actually, in Hadrian's reign. And nobody has any idea what happened to that. It's another one which might have been destroyed in the Jewish war of that period, but there's no evidence of it being there. So the 9th is far from alone, far from being unique in the manner of its mysterious disappearance.
Thank you. I'll just do a couple more, if I may. Quite a big question, this. A number of people have asked about just how hostile an environment was it for the Roman army in northern Britain at this time. I mean, I think many of us would instinctively assume about, you know, the superiority of the Roman army, and yet you seem to be painting a picture of the fact that they did suffer defeats and casualties. I mean, what's your personal take? How tough a time did the Roman army have in northern Britain in that sort of beginning of the reign of the Emperor Hadrian?
Well, my personal view is that they did face severe military problems, and that's what Hadrian's Wall is all about. But of course, it's an interesting question to ask because it illustrates that, well, two things. A, there is a debate about this. There is a difference of opinion. Historians and archaeologists differ, but also opinion shifts over time. And I think you simply have to look comparatively through books written about the Northern Frontier or Hadrian's Wall over the last 30 or 40 years. And you will see, I would say, a general increasing shift towards a view which sees serious military problems for the Romans on the northern frontier.
And I think just the last question, Nick, if I may, you sort of make a good case for the fact that the 9th Legion may have been split up into a number of different parts in different parts of the country, perhaps some in York, some in Carlisle, in other places. And so I kind of asked, isn't that sort of slightly curious? Doesn't that sort of diminish the power of the Legion as a fighting force? Why would the Romans split those large 5,000 strong shock troops into sort of smaller units? That seems to negate their value.
Well, it's certainly what they did. I mean, part of it is that there was a finite number of Roman troops, and I mean this was another problem for the Romans. It relates to the earlier question of the severity of the military problems which they faced. They couldn't just go on raising legions willy-nilly. There were only ever about 30 legions at any one time around the frontiers of the Roman Empire. And although in times of emergency, military emergency, we should say, some new legions were created, it was never a great number. And there does seem to have been a limit on the amount of recruitment that could take place, the resource that could be put into enlarging the Roman army. Now that meant, because as far as the Roman emperor was concerned, he wasn't just dealing with one province, he was dealing with the whole frontiers around the empire. it meant that sometimes things got stretched in two different directions. And Trajan in 105 to 6 embarks on his second Dacian war. So there's a great movement of troops into what is now Romania, the Danube area. And this is why, and that means moving troops from Germany, from the Lower Rhine, eastwards towards the Danube area. And that's why a detachment of the 9th and various other units from Britain get moved to Nijmegen and Low Germany. They're simply being moved to plug a gap which has been created by, it's a domino effect. They've been moved to plug a gap which has been created by the movement of the troops that were there before further east. And this happens all the time in the 2nd century. Wars take place in one province, so detachments have to be taken from legions, and auxiliary troops have to accompany them to move to where the war is taking place. But the reason they take a detachment, the reason they only take part, is they can't take the whole thing, because if they did that, they would leave the place where the legion was coming from undefended. And in the end, this you get into the 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire, this actually became unsustainable. And that's why in the late Roman Empire, they moved to having a central field army that they had sort of low-grade troops on the frontiers, which were just there all the time, and they created a central field army that could be really flexible and move to where the problems were. But from Hadrian onwards, for about 150 years, you have this situation where the legions are strung around the frontiers, and they're constantly having to split them up and shuffle them about to deal with the various crises that occur. And obviously legionaries were needed in the Hadrians Wall area near Carlisle. So we have a detachment of the 9th there, detachment of the 20th as well, in the period that I've been discussing. Some were still in the base at York, to judge from the building that was going on, but some went across to the continent. And incidentally, if you think it's odd that they take troops from York, from the north of Britain, to go across to Lower Germany, it's not as odd as it may seem if you think about it, because York is actually best placed for a sea crossing. The other legions were in Chester and Caerleon, involve much more transport to get them across to the continent.
Well, thank you, Nick. And you've answered some tricky questions there. And there's so many others I could have asked, which we've had in, but I think the number of questions and the range of topics shows the interest that your lectures generated. I think just to wrap up, firstly, I'd like to thank my colleague from Copford Archaeology, Caroline Adams, who's done a great job in the technical engineering of this Zoom lecture. So thank you, Kaz, done a great job in getting me and Nick to be able to work this thing. But really to you, Nick, it's been so evident that we've been in the presence of a true expert who understands the evidence and has obviously thought deeply about this topic over many years. And I think what tonight's talk has said to me is that sometimes unfairly, Hadrian's Wall is sort of branded as a rather sort of niche topic, which is a bit distant from the rest of many other aspects of Roman Britain. But actually what Hadrian's Wall does do is shine a light on some of the really big questions of Roman Britain. Just how tough was it campaigning? Just how much did the Northern Britons buy into the Roman concept? So you've had so many positive comments in the chat box. Thank you very much, and lastly, thank you to everyone else who's listened in and tonight. As you leave, it would be great if you could take the time to complete the survey. It'll only do this, but really, thank you all very much. Thank you, Nick. Good night, everybody, and we'll be back next year with another topic on another aspect of Roman Britain. So thank you and good night.